Everybody, welcome back to Immigration and Mobility Decoded, a podcast where we speak with experts in the fields of global mobility, immigration, relocation, and everything in between. I'm pleased to be joined by Jimmy Brazelton today from GeoVisions. Jimmy, thanks for joining us.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
So Jimmy, you are an international education leader, growth professional, and an expert in educational and cultural exchange visa programs. And that's going to be a lot about what we talk about today. Currently, you're the Managing Director of GeoVisions, an Austin-based company that guides foreign workers, trainees, teachers, and more through the immigration process in the U.S. Jimmy, to kick it off, can you just talk a little bit about your career background, what brought you to become Managing Director of GeoVisions, and really what the inspiration behind your career path has been?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me on. This is a great opportunity to talk about what I love most, which is cultural exchange. I actually started in college. I started working in the study abroad office because I needed a job and they needed someone who had some data skills. So I had never been outside the country. I had never been outside of the Midwest before. I'm from Illinois originally. And they offered me the opportunity to work in the international office and help with international students. And eventually they paid for me to lead a study abroad program. That was my first time outside the country. So it's really luck, and thanks to some people who were also true believers in the value of cultural exchange and how it can transform someone's life. And that's really what I've tried to continue to emulate throughout my career. I then became the director of the study abroad office at that same university. I then went into the private sector at a private study abroad company for many years. And so when this opportunity at GeoVisions became available to work instead of just sending Americans abroad, I wanted to get back to where I started a bit with those international students coming to the university and seeing the impact it had on their lives. And working with J-1 programs seemed like a perfect way to do that.
Yeah, and a bit of housekeeping just for our listeners and viewers today, right, who may not be familiar with the subject matter, but could you explain what the J-1 visa program is? Maybe starting with the history of the visa, how it came about, and then how it's primarily used, which I know is a bit of a loaded question. I know you'll get into that.
No, absolutely. I'm happy to. So the J-1 visa was really an outgrowth of what started as, the Fulbright program, right, in the 60s, and the desire after World War II and to really grow cultural understanding and international understanding among cultures. And so out of that grew the J-1 program, which is really designed to facilitate cultural exchange. It's not an employment program. I think there are 13 different designations under the J-1 program, all designed to do different things, but the focus of all of them is on cultural exchange and to provide opportunities for visitors to the U.S. to really experience what it's like being in the U.S. and to understand what Americans are like, and then they can go back to their home countries and talk about their experience, talk about what it was like for them. So the J-1 program has facilitated it's a soft diplomacy program, really. It's really meant to provide these experiences that no other area of the government really facilitates other than the Department of State in this diplomatic way.
Yeah, I think one thing that's super interesting about the J-1 visa program is there are a lot of Americans out there today who probably have no idea that they've interacted with a J-1 participant, right? We were talking before the podcast, but growing up for me on the coast of Maine, I worked at seafood restaurants in the summer, and we wouldn't have operated without the J-1 visa program. We had the owners of the restaurants would bring in folks from mostly Eastern Europe who'd come here for the summer. A lot of times they were university students. They'd come here, work as busboys, they'd work in the kitchen, they'd fill really key roles at the restaurant that there wasn't enough local labor to fill, quite frankly. And I would get to interact with these kids, with these, I call them kids, they're, probably in their teens, early 20s. I'd get to interact with them and learn a lot about Moldova, which I couldn't have pointed out on a map at the time, or Serbia, which is probably the same thing. I couldn't have pointed out on the map at the time. And I was a history buff, and we got to talk about, the history of World War II, which I was learning about in high school, and they had their own perspective being from Eastern Europe. And on the flip side, they were honing their English, getting better at it, getting an experience of working, a summer job in a small American town in coastal Maine, and then going back to their home country, going back to university, and really having that experience of American culture. And oftentimes they'd come back, a few summers after that again and again and again. And some eventually, came over here through a different visa path and stayed for the long run, and a lot just went home. So I think it's really a visa that most Americans probably have no idea they have a connection with, right?
That's exactly right. The J-1 visa program isn't that large compared to the overall population or the overall workforce in the U.S. And yet they anyone who's been on a vacation in the U.S. has probably, as you mentioned, interacted with J-1. Usually on the summer work travel, J-1 designation is where it's most common. Most theme parks in the U.S., most touristy locations are utilizing the J-1 program, and it's really gone through an incredible transformation in the last 10 years or so, I would say, and it's been refined very heavily into this very well run, high quality program that the host employers across the US that utilize are not generally just interested in filling these vital roles that you mentioned. They can't fill domestically. They serve a vital economic need, but the host employers are genuinely interested and excited about the connections that are made. Populations from one country end up having a bit of a historical relationship in regions of the U.S., like you mentioned, Moldova and Serbia in Maine. I mean, that's been going on for quite some time. And so it's forged these connections where now people from Maine are going to Serbia because maybe they hosted someone from that country in the past. And so these international connections we wouldn't have nearly as many of them. We wouldn't be the country we are if we didn't have these types of cultural interactions that we value.
Yeah, well said. And you mentioned the different designations under the J-1 program, and maybe you can unpack that a bit more because there are lots of different types of J-1 visa pathways. Our audience tends to be more skewed towards corporate immigration professionals, so they're very familiar with the H-1B visa, which has a very specific purpose, right? And applicants of the H-1B have to meet certain criteria. The J-1's a bit broader. Can you maybe unpack that a bit?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there are 13 different designations. GeoVisions works with four. So each organization, each sponsor, as we're called, those that sponsor the J-1 visa, tends to have a different focus in terms of what we do. So at GeoVisions, for example, we sponsor the summer work travel J-1 program, the intern, the trainee program, and the teacher exchange program. But unlike the programs you mentioned through Department of Labor, like the H-1B or other visas that are run through Department of Labor, these are really focused on specific areas of cultural exchange. And so while the summer work travel program is meant to focus on these short-term college students coming for just 3 months to the U.S. During their summer break from university, you also have the teacher exchange program, which is the second longest J-1 visa that can be for up to 5 years. And so this is a longer-term cultural exchange. And so these programs can vary quite widely in how long they last, sort of the nature and the industries or the types of connections that are trying to be forged there. There's also physician exchanges that are a separate category. There's the au pair program, which many listeners may be familiar with because it has such a long history in the U.S. There's high school student exchanges, and so each of these are narrowly focused, but again, all follow that same short-term non-immigrant visa to the U.S. People that are coming, experiencing U.S. culture, having some training or teaching or learning aspect of it, and then going back to their home countries.
Right. At the beginning, you really mentioned that your background is in the education space, and maybe we can dive in a bit more to the aspect of the J-1 visa program that is for education, right? Can you maybe describe what the education pathway for the J-1 program? Maybe I'll ask it this way: what is that pathway supposed to look like? What does it look like in the past, and what does it look like in reality now in terms of how J-1 participants are interacting with the U.S. education system?
Sure. I think traditionally there were two main education-focused J-1 programs, to my mind at least. There's the Scholar Program, which is really meant for universities to bring in international scholars for short-term to be visiting professors and researchers and things of that nature. In the K-12 education space, the Teacher Exchange Program, it's a very small program. There are, I think, less than 6,000 J-1 teacher visas granted each year. So it's a very small category, but a very meaningful one. And the only one that really was designed and focused on the K through 12 professional space. And then you have the high school exchanges, so high school students coming on the J-1 program. But as you mentioned, it has evolved in some ways. GeoVisions last year, we launched a new program focused on utilizing the intern and trainee designations under the J-1 visa for education placements. So these are people who are currently studying education at their home universities in their home countries, or maybe they recently graduated or they just started working as a teacher in their home country, and they can come to the US and they can work as teaching assistants or special education assistants. And I say work, really, they come and they train or they're learning. It's really an education-focused opportunity for them to see what the U.S. education system is like, learn how the U.S. education system is different from their home country's education system, and learn about teaching techniques that they can bring back to their home country to help them in their early career as an education professional. So these are much shorter than the teacher program. These are 12 months, maximum 18 months for the trainee program. So it's really meant for them to learn more about what it means to be an educator in the U.S. And the U.S. has long, had one of the strongest education systems in the world. And so the opportunity for people to come and learn about, for example, special education in the U.S., which is a very specific way of teaching special education that the rest of the world doesn't quite do the same way. Integrated classes, for example, where we have special education students and non-special education students in the same classrooms in the U.S., is something that's not uncommon. It's a really interesting way to teach special education students, and I can't think of any other country that has that integrated model, right? And so we had trainees from Colombia. I think it was our first group of educational trainees from Colombia. They came and they were special education assistants in a public school district in the U.S. And by the end of their program, after 18 months, I remember having lunch with them and them saying, it's really changed their entire view of what special education can look like in their home countries. And they went back and they founded a special education school in Colombia to really implement the practices they learned in the U.S.
Wow.
So really interesting and powerful things happening through this very new way of using the J-1 program, the intern and trainee program specifically for education.
It's so fascinating. I mean, it's a cliche to say that Americans are very, insular, right? We tend not to care or think much about what goes on in the rest of the world. And it really is amazing to think about all of the cultural exchange that goes on through this program and then reverberates back out to countries around the world.
Exactly.
One thing that I was eager to ask you about, and as I was refreshing my brain on the J-1 visa program, is all of the different stakeholders who have a vested interest in this program and who are involved in it. You're set to speak next week at a community forum hosted by Bridge USA and a local chamber of commerce in the Midwest. And given that this episode will be released next week, I'm hoping you could give us a sneak peek of what you're planning and talking about at that event. And then maybe also explain what Bridge USA is, because I think that'll be interesting to the audience, and who the other stakeholders that are generally invested in the J-1 visa program are.
Sure, I'm happy to, and I'm really excited about this event. So just in brief, this community forum that's happening is designed to bring community members. This is in Branson, Missouri, which has been hosting J-1 participants from multiple different designations, but in particular the summer work travel program. And they really, as a community, wanted to grow and invest in the J-1 program, which is really exciting. But not everyone has, as you mentioned at the beginning, a large knowledge base of what the J-1 program is. And often it can be confused because people think that, they think of a visa coming to the U.S. and they immediately think of immigration. Not all visas are immigration, right? And that's something I think is not common knowledge among, Americans. So this community forum is a great opportunity to bring host organizations, host employers, school districts, those that host J-1 participants, And the Department of State, we have Ethan Brashofsky from the Department of State, who's going to be in attendance at this event, and J-1 visa sponsors such as GeoVisions, together to talk about what this program is, how it works, answer questions from the community about how the program impacts them and how the program can grow and improve. One of the people attending the event is a developer who is building brand new accommodation facilities specifically for J-1 participants to help solve some of the housing challenges when visitors come to the U.S. for short-term programs of just 3 months, and finding affordable housing solutions. So really a lot of people coming together, all the stakeholders coming together to talk about how these programs work. Bridge USA, as you mentioned, that's a term that was coined, I think, just 4 years ago or so by Department of State as a rebranding of the private sector exchanges. So within the J-1 category, there are private sector exchanges, such as the ones that we've been talking about. But there's also public J-1 programs, which are the largest of the J-1 programs, by the way. Things like Fulbright that people are probably more familiar with. Those are public exchanges. Those are sponsored. Those receive direct funding from the government. Whereas the private sector exchanges, such as the summer work travel, intern, and most of the intern and training, the teacher exchanges, as well as au pair and a few others, these are privately, funded and managed exchange programs that are funded through program fees paid through host organizations or from participants directly sometimes. And so the Department of State has rebranded it into Bridge USA to sort of capture that overarching concept of private sector exchanges.
I wonder, because I find it fascinating that this is sort of a regional event that you'll be speaking at, right? Obviously, there's some federal government influence there as well, with the Department of State attending. And we kicked off the podcast by talking about how I had experience interacting with J-1 visa holders, J-1 participants growing up in Maine. Is there any sort of regional trends when it comes to where J-1 participants are going in the United States? Does the Southeast tend to have a certain, more au pairs in the Southeast? I'm just making this up, or more, summer work travel participants in the Northeast, anything like that, or is that not really a trend?
There's definitely trends that are occurring in terms of regions and which regions are growing or diminishing in terms of hosting J-1 participants. And a big part of that is availability and affordability of housing. That's really one of the big drivers of the J-1 programs, because these are short-term programs. These aren't people that are coming and moving to the U.S. permanently. Short-term housing in the U.S. has an availability and affordability issue across most of the country, but especially in the big tourist locations where, for example, the work and travel programs tend to have a majority of participants. And so as housing availability and affordability becomes an issue in one location, another location that tries to solve that problem, such as Branson or the Dells in Wisconsin that has built housing facilities. These are some innovative solutions to helping to sustain the J-1 program in a way that is affordable for poor college students coming from other countries to the U.S. So that's one trend. I think another trend is what you had talked about with your experience, is these country-to-country relationships that develop, almost like sister city type of relationships without that formality behind it. You have groups of participants coming from one country to a specific city in the U.S. over time, then that develops a relationship and that helps sustain it because it becomes personal. It becomes something that the city is proud of, that is something the city celebrates. Having this specific nationality with this long relationship coming to that location, that helps sustain a program and keep it going despite other challenges that may occur, and can really be a really great way for the community to understand and appreciate the J-1 program, since they may hear that, hey, we have a large number of Moldovans, as you mentioned, who are in this location, but they may not know it's because of the J-1 program. And so making that connection helps other organizations say, well, maybe I can host some J-1 participants from Moldova as well, and then get these communities and these pockets that develop.
It's a common theme on this podcast when we talk to folks who are more focused on the immigration and mobility, side of things, that they bring up aspects like housing and financial literacy in the U.S. and how to get a car, right? Transportation. There's so many other aspects than just securing a J-1 visa, for example, that impacts the experience of both the organization that the individual is coming to work or learn from, and the individual themselves. I lived out in California for a while. I spent a lot of time up in North Lake Tahoe, another area that heavily utilizes the J-1 visa program. And it's interesting that you brought up housing, because my friend who worked at a restaurant, he was a restaurant manager there in North Lake Tahoe. He lived in a house, and in the neighboring house was owned by the restaurant, and that's where they would put up a lot of their J-1 summer work travel folks. And it was really fun for me, because we'd go up on the weekend and get to interact with these guys and gals who are our age from different countries, and just hang out and learn, and about how they grew up and their experience and everything. And a lot of that was just fostered from them having housing right next to where we were staying too, which was a whole nother component of the cultural exchange there. I wanted to pivot a bit. We're recording this on October 4th, and what we're about to talk about certainly isn't the most interesting thing going on in Congress right now, but I think it is important. A few weeks ago, Congressman Andy Biggs of Arizona, he failed to get an amendment passed that would have stripped funding for America's cultural exchange programs through the representative's budget appropriation process. And again, there's a lot of things up in the air when it comes to the House of Representatives budget appropriation process right now. But focusing on that Biggs amendment, can you talk about what happened there? And then maybe explain, what are the general political sentiments of lawmakers and just regular Americans who maybe have some, knowledge of the J-1 program and of cultural exchange programs on the J-1 program?
No, it's such an odd and interesting moment when Representative Biggs added that amendment. And just to adjust that a little bit, it's not that he failed to get the amendment added. He withdrew it himself after adding it, actually. Largely, I think, because I don't think he realized how unpopular that was going to be. Because we've talked about the people that host J-1 participants, and these are small business owners in locations that rely on the J-1 program for their work and travel in particular. And so I think people that are not familiar with the J-1 program, like I imagine Representative Biggs may not be, don't realize what a crucial part of our economy it is, what a crucial part of regional identities it is. And so it sounds like by him choosing to withdraw that himself before it was considered, that the advocacy efforts made by the Alliance for International Exchange, for example, by the Department of State itself, by others to educate people, including Representative Biggs, about the J-1 program, I'm hoping had that desired effect of educating, right, about learning what this program is and is not. It is true that I think people who are unfamiliar with the J-1 program may see it as a pathway for people to come to the U.S. and stay in the U.S., right? It's not the intention of the program. People that come on the J-1 visa are across the board required to return back to their home country, because part of the purpose of cultural exchange is to close that loop by having them share their experience back in their home country, right? So these programs are necessarily designed for that purpose. Those that may be more cynical, those that maybe have other agendas, I've seen try to make a case for J-1 visa being a pathway for illegal immigration. That's not borne out by the data. It's not borne out by anything in reality by any means, because the J-1 visa is so strictly controlled, because we have so many regulations that we as sponsors are required to follow and go through training and train others on, and are audited on, and there's a lot of controls around these programs to prevent it being used in ways other than what it's intended. I think those that aren't aware of all of those aspects of the program, I can understand how they may, through ignorance, see it as something other than what it is. But that's why I think these advocacy efforts are just so important. As I mentioned before, the Alliance for International Exchange, which is the primary advocacy group for the Bridge USA programs, is so effective at pulling data about the economic impact, about the visa return rates, and all the different types of data that we have, thankfully, that show what a boon this program is for our country in every way, economically, sociopolitically, identity and values. I mean, there's just really no downside. It contributes to our economy. I can't remember the exact stat, but I think $1 billion a year to the economy or something, just by virtue of people coming for 3 months or a year and spending their money here, right? And to working in positions that otherwise would not be filled. So yeah, I think it's a constant struggle. I think it's a good struggle for us to be aware of and to continue to educate. One of the reasons I'm excited about being on this podcast is to help others understand that these cultural exchange programs are just these vehicles for understanding, and I hope more people take advantage of them.
I think one of the silver linings of immigration really becoming such a polarizing issue, especially in the last 5 or 10 years, is that it is exposing lawmakers who maybe never would have focused on the minutia of America's immigration system. It's forcing them to look in this. The example with Representative Biggs is perfect, right? A lot of policymakers and lawmakers don't understand our immigration system and all the different components of it and who it impacts in America and in their congressional district, for example. And by, obviously there's a lot of issues with the polarization around immigration, and you see polls of political candidates, and they ask Americans, how do you view so-and-so's position on immigration as a broad painting it with a broad brush, which is always frustrating for me. But I think it is important. It is important to shine a light on how significant and crucial these programs are, like you said, for America's overall economic health. And there's folks in DC in the policy and advocacy space who are doing great work on presenting the data to show that and tell that story. But then there are also the anecdotal stories like we've been talking about today, and I'm sure you have thousands of them with the clients that you work with, of the impact of just one individual coming over to the U.S. on an exchange program, the impact that they can have on an organization, on a business, on an educational institution. I think that it's really, really important that those individual stories get told more and more as well.
I completely agree. These individual stories are really what keeps us going. We had our whole company meeting last week, and the entire week was really spent on each of the staff telling their stories about this past year and what participant experiences that they've had, where they've been on site with these host companies and with the students and participants, and seeing the amazing things happening. And you're right, the J-1 programs get caught up in this immigration debate when they have nothing to do with immigration, right? So it's always shocking to us when people come out with very strong opinions about J-1 visa programs, and and the opinions are really related to immigration in the U.S. And since these programs have nothing to do with immigration, it's always a bit of a struggle for us to take those opinions seriously, since they're divorced from reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to give you a chance to talk a bit more about GeoVisions, because I'm sure we have listeners and viewers who we touched on it a bit throughout the conversation, but who may be interested in what GeoVisions does and the work that you do. Could you maybe just explain, what work you do and what work the organization does?
Absolutely. So I mentioned that we do the summer work travel, the intern, trainee, and the teach exchanges as really those are the types of programs that we sponsor, the types of designations under the J-1 visa that we sponsor. So as a J-1 visa sponsor, our role is twofold, really. Is one, developing relationships with host organizations in the U.S. who are interested in hosting J-1 students and participants and teachers, and then working with our own offices around the world, or sometimes with partner agencies in countries, to find good fits for those placements. And so finding that match, I think, is a big part of the role that we play. And then, of course, the other side of this is the compliance side. As I mentioned, there are so many regulations around the J-1 visa that I'm glad are there, because it ensures that these programs maintain their focus and continue the role they play in our country. But it is our responsibility as the sponsor to uphold those regulations. And so a big part of what we do is facilitate, the J-1 visa process from A to Z, ensuring that throughout that process that every regulation regarding the J-1 visa is followed and those steps are taken. That's everything from data management and record keeping to appropriate activity for participants. So if they come to the U.S. and they're in a placement and they change placements and want to go work somewhere else, for example, on the work and travel program, it's our responsibility to evaluate that placement, evaluate that company. Do they have the correct insurance? Do they have the correct intentions for this cultural exchange program? Or are they just trying to hire someone to fill a need? It's our responsibility to evaluate those things and ensure that the program is being used for the purpose for which it's intended. And so we're really excited about the journey that we've been on since COVID. We rebounded very, very rapidly. The J-1 visa program under the Trump administration and then during COVID, it was a very challenging period, I think, for all sponsors. And for us, coming back after COVID and under a new administration and being able to continue the work that we do, and the term we continue using is filling our cups by seeing the good work that's being done, the good impact these programs are having on the participants and the communities. That's been really fulfilling, and seeing these programs grow because of the new ways we're trying to introduce the J-1 program, like the educational internships and trainee programs that I mentioned, but also to diversify the program. We're doing a lot more to recruit out of West and Sub-Saharan Africa, which are very underrepresented areas when it comes to cultural exchange, so that we can continue growing that understanding across cultures, which is what the program's intended for.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating work, Jimmy. It's really cool to hear about. I have a two-prong question for you. So for folks who maybe this podcast episode reaches, who are interested in becoming a J-1 host but have no idea where to start, or for folks who want to apply for the J-1 visa program, a foreign national from abroad. I hesitate to use the word foreign national because I know it's important to distinguish the cultural exchange program from immigration, right? But for anyone who fits that bill, who's interested in participating in the J-1 visa program, what advice would you give those two personas?
I would tell both of those personas, first of all, what is your goal in participating in this program? Because if it's anything other than facilitating cultural exchange, it may not be the right fit for you, right? On the host organization side, the main thing that I talk to new potential host organizations about, especially school districts, that's really who I'm connecting with most these days, is, when you're looking at hosting someone from another country, you're thinking about the placement they'll have, about what they might be doing, what their training or their program is going to look like. But are we also thinking about where they're going to live? What types of cultural activities are they going to be doing once they're here to make sure they get a well-rounded experience and see as much of the U.S. culture that they're located in, that regional culture, that local culture, the national culture? What aspects of the U.S. are they going to learn about while they're here? And planning that in advance so that we can ensure that this is a positive experience for everyone involved. And then from there, the rest of it is paperwork, and the regulations, which we take care of. So we walk them through it. We have some incredible technology that we've invested in to make it much easier, where they can log into a portal and build a training plan, ask all the questions for you, so you can just go through and figure out what needs to be done, and then enter it in so that we can generate these government forms automatically for them. I think the introduction of the electronic DS 2019, I know it's a lot of jargon, but just last year we're allowed to issue visa forms electronically, which is saving a lot of time for people. So making that process easier is what our responsibility is for them. Their responsibility is to make sure that the program is really is organized well and organized for the right purpose. And for potential participants, I think it's also about their goals for the program, but English levels, of course, are very important. We do have to ensure that anyone coming on the J-1 program has sufficient English to be successful while they're here. We do that through a couple of different ways, including utilizing the ITEP, the International Test of English Proficiency, for our education placements. And so talking to participants, it's such a joy. I mean, going abroad and meeting with potential participants is one of the great joys of my role, and seeing their aspirations and what they want to do with their lives and how the J1 program is going to help them achieve that. And then when they find out that they've been accepted on the program, they've been, they have a placement or they've been hired by a company in the U.S. We have so many videos and photos, and there's so many of my team that have memories of students just jumping up and down and so excited that they're going to be able to come to the U.S. So I think then it becomes about setting expectations, because just like with my study abroad students that I used to work with from the US going abroad, it can be really exciting, but the realities of going to another country and the challenges that are inherent in something as brave as traveling to another country for a short-term period, I think are valuable to consider. And so the orientation aspect, the preparation aspect, then starts to set in, and thinking about what the realities of the program will be like so that we can have a positive experience. That's the other part I think that we spend a lot of time with participants on.
One question we like to ask our guests often on the podcast is if there's anyone listening or viewing or sees a clip from the podcast that is interested in kind of following the Jimmy Brazelton career path. You outlined what it looked like a little bit, and maybe you could talk a bit more about what your day-to-day looks like and where you've traveled as of late. But what advice would you give somebody who's trying to break into the field that you're in?
No, I love that, and I love advising young people looking to break into international education and cultural exchange, because we do need new ideas. We need new people. We need new young people entering into these areas to help us grow and develop and innovate. And so my advice, I say take with a grain of salt, because while I have a long history in a long career in these areas, as my beard gets whiter and I get older, I realize that these fields have changed too, and the ways that I entered. As I mentioned, I was incredibly lucky and fortunate and fell into this space. And I think that's harder to do than it was when I first entered, and recognizing what that may be like for young people looking for a career path, I think is important for all of us who have been in the industry for a long time to recognize. But I think my advice generally would be that if you're interested in getting involved in cultural exchange, I bet there's the community you're in some way has some cultural exchange aspect, or has some cultural exchange need that you can help facilitate. And so a lot of people who are in the J1 visa space started out by working in community support groups, for example, which are these organizations that help to support J1 participants in the communities. The local chambers of commerce, who are now getting more interested and involved in the J1 program and how it impacts the businesses in their communities. Have ways to engage on that as well, talking to local businesses and school districts about the J1 program and seeing how you can help support J1 participants in the country. All those types of activities, when I look at hiring, for example, for GeoVisions, anyone that shows what I call that true believer in cultural exchange mentality, someone who genuinely, truly believes in the power of cultural exchange, that is incredibly valuable and something you can't teach. So demonstrating that you share those values, that you hold those beliefs as well through your volunteering efforts, through your past experiences, through your university experience, and maybe the involvement you have with international students at your university, those I think are really valuable ways to get involved in the space. I think your second part of your question was about where I've traveled and where I've been lately, and it's been an interesting space. So I was just 2 weeks ago, I was in Lisbon in Portugal for the annual WISTIC conference, which is a meeting of the of agencies and sponsors and other organizations, Department of State, and accommodation providers around the world to talk about youth travel. And it's a really wonderful conference and a really wonderful way to talk about the J1 program in the larger context of student youth travel around the world. And I really appreciate engaging with those professionals because they have a different perspective and broader view of what youth travel looks like today. We actually had one of the keynote speakers was vice president at TikTok, who was talking about how TikTok travel and the travel subgenre of TikTok content has spawned and facilitated more types of travel among young people. So looking at those avenues and seeing what young people are looking for in their travel experiences worldwide, not just Americans, but for people from all countries around the world, I think is really valuable for us. Other than that, it's mostly been going to visit schools and companies around the U.S. and seeing my participants and seeing what their experiences have been and talking to them about what's been good and what's been challenging and what can they teach to other students who will be coming next year.
Yeah, I want to follow up on the final point you made there on TikTok and social media in general, and the sub travel genre that you mentioned in those social media platforms. I think in the last 10, 10, maybe 5 years is when it started to accelerate. You've seen just a massive wave of content sharing on these social media platforms of, hey, I work on a cruise ship and this is what I do. This is what my day looks like, or hey, I'm a J-1 participant, working in a restaurant in Maine, and here's what my day looks like. And there's so much more available information out there that can inspire maybe not only folks who may want to participate in these cultural exchange programs, but just folks who would want to bring in and sponsor these potential J-1 applicants that have been perpetuated by social media. You've been in the industry for a long time. What's your view of how social media and the internet has impacted cultural exchange programs?
I think, in my experience, I'm really interested in people who have never had those types of experiences and seeing how they can have that experience. It's about access for me. And so social media and the types of travel-based content that are being developed now, to me, really revolve around showing people what's possible. And I think it's incredibly valuable to see someone do a short, heavily edited, cut video saying, okay, packing my bag. Oh, one of those videos, for example, where they say, oh, here's someone watching a video about some dish they had in some cafe in Italy, right? And then they go, oh, and then they start packing their bags and they go on the plane and they, show all the stuff and they go and have that exact same dish. That kind of spontaneous travel, I think really speaks to people who are reticent to take that spontaneous trip or reticent to, expand their cultural experiences outside of where they're comfortable. And that's expanding cultural experiences, experiencing other cultures is not an easy thing. It's not a comfortable thing, and nor should it be. I think as an educator as well, that's part of it. Education shouldn't be comfortable because where you grow is generally where you feel uncomfortable. And so using social media as a way to help people get comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable, I find incredibly useful. I find incredibly inspiring about the youth travel space right now.
Yeah, no, it's really incredible. And I think, the motivation of J-1 participants over the last few decades has always been, it's always been a group of folks who are highly motivated to learn, right? That's the whole point of cultural exchange. And I think it's awesome that social media has, created an environment where there's more exposure to even more people who may have not known exactly what was out there, what's available to them. And I'm happy to be a part of that by having hosted you on the podcast and having you explain GeoVisions work. And we hope that folks who maybe listen and are interested in learning more about GeoVisions get in contact with you. Jimmy, with that, with that, any final thoughts that we didn't get into, anything you want to plug or where listeners can follow you?
No, I welcome you to follow us on our Instagram and Facebook channels are the main ways that we communicate with our participants in particular. I think it's fun if you're not a participant, if you're a host organization, to see what the participants are talking about. Of course, our website, www.geovisions.com, which will be updated very, very soon and look quite a bit better. But otherwise, feel free to reach out to us. I think in whatever way is easiest for you so that we can talk about what you can contribute to the cultural exchange space and how we can work together to make that happen.
Awesome. Well, appreciate that, Jimmy. Appreciate you coming on. I've learned a lot in just this short 45-minute chat, and I hope to have you back on soon if you'd be willing in the next couple of months. Give us an update on the latest and greatest, and tell us what you've been working on.
I'd love to. That'd be great. Thanks, Finn.
Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to Immigration and Mobility Decoded. If you watched this video on YouTube and you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to the Envoy Global YouTube channel for more content like this. Otherwise, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks everyone.